Just when everyone thought the noise around Caitlin Clark had finally died down, something happened that quietly reset the entire conversation. No press conference. No dramatic announcement from the league. No apology tours or public explanations. Just a subtle shift that sent shockwaves through coaching circles and longtime power brokers who believed they still controlled the direction of women's basketball. Because this time, the story wasn't about minutes played, foul calls, or who deserved a roster spot. It wasn't even about winning. It was about who actually owns the future of the sport. Behind closed doors, there are growing reports of frustration and outright panic tied to a strategic move involving NBC. A move that many insiders say exposed an uncomfortable truth the league has tried to avoid for years. The idea that all progress flows through teams, systems, and experience suddenly doesn't hold up when billions of dollars are on the line. And the people who believed they could slow the rise of a rookie by controlling access? They're realizing that plan never stood a chance. For months, the message from the establishment was clear. This league values balance. It values defense. It values chemistry. And above all, it values patience. Stars are supposed to wait their turn. Attention is something you earn slowly, after years of proving loyalty to the system. That philosophy worked when the league was small, niche, and fighting for relevance. But that world doesn't exist anymore. What's changed isn't just popularity or highlight reels. It's money, media rights, audience behavior, the kind of attention that can't be coached away or benched. And according to multiple reports, this latest NBC-related development confirmed what many executives already knew but didn't want to say out loud. The gravitational center of women's basketball has shifted, and it isn't sitting in a coach's office. That realization has reportedly triggered intense reactions inside certain camps, especially among those who believed that winning gold medals and enforcing hierarchy would keep them in control. Because suddenly, the narrative they worked so hard to enforce, that Clark wasn't ready, that she needed to be humbled, that experience mattered more than momentum, collapsed under the weight of cold, unforgiving data. The uncomfortable part? None of this required Clark to say a word. No interviews. No complaints. No demands. The market spoke for her. The cameras followed the attention. And the attention followed one name. While coaches focused on rotations and matchups, broadcasters were studying charts, trends, and engagement curves that told a very different story about where the future was headed. This isn't a basketball debate anymore. It's a power struggle between tradition and reality. Between those who believe control comes from authority, and those who understand control comes from the audience. And once that audience makes up its mind, there's no rulebook that can put things back the way they were. What's unfolding now isn't a misunderstanding or a temporary controversy. It's a collision. One side is fighting to protect a system built on collective identity and earned respect. The other side is investing heavily in a phenomenon that doesn't need permission to exist. And the most unsettling part for the old guard? This shift didn't happen loudly. It happened quietly, strategically, and with signatures on contracts that changed everything overnight. Because once media partners start moving this way, there's no reversing it. And the people who thought they were steering the ship are suddenly realizing they're no longer holding the wheel. That's why this moment matters. Not because of a single player. Not because of a single network. But because it reveals something much bigger about where power actually lives in modern sports, and who loses it when the game evolves faster than the rules meant to contain it. The tension everyone is reacting to now didn't begin with NBC. It didn't even begin with television. It started months earlier, at the exact moment the Team USA roster was finalized, and one name was missing. When Caitlin Clark was left off the Olympic team, the decision was presented as clean, rational, and purely basketball-related. Coaches emphasized defense, chemistry, experience. They framed it as a matter of fit, not talent. A long-term view rather than a short-term splash. On the surface, it sounded responsible, professional, almost impossible to argue with. But outside those press statements, the reaction was immediate, and far louder than expected. Fans didn't just disagree. They questioned the motive. Analysts didn't just debate matchups. They pointed out that the most visible player in women's basketball was being sidelined at the exact moment the sport was begging for global attention. And while the coaching staff insisted this wasn't personal, the optics told a very different story. To a growing audience, it felt less like a basketball decision and more like a line being drawn. The underlying message, whether intended or not, was simple. No matter how popular you are, the system comes first. That idea might have worked in another era. But this wasn't happening in a vacuum. Clark had just come off a stretch of attention unlike anything the league had ever experienced. Arenas were filling. Ratings were spiking. Every appearance was an event. And suddenly, the league's biggest stage was moving forward without the player driving the most interest. That disconnect is what turned a roster decision into a flashpoint. What made it worse was the tone surrounding it. Comments from within the basketball establishment leaned heavily on the idea that Clark needed to learn, to adjust, to wait. Not in a hostile way, at least not openly, but in a condescending one. As if popularity itself was something suspicious. As if visibility had to be earned slowly, regardless of demand. To longtime fans, that sounded familiar. The WNBA had always prided itself on being different. Less flashy. More team-oriented. And that identity mattered deeply to the people who built it. But for newer viewers, many of whom were watching women's basketball seriously for the first time, the message landed differently. It didn't sound principled. It sounded like gatekeeping. And while the coaches likely believed the gold medal would end the debate, what they didn't anticipate was how little that victory would matter to people outside the basketball bubble. Because the argument wasn't about whether Team USA could win without Clark. It was about why the league's most magnetic figure was being treated like a liability instead of an asset. That question didn't go away after the podium ceremony. It lingered. It spread. And more importantly, it reached people who don't care about rotations or defensive schemes at all. People who care about storylines, stars, and why they should tune in. What looked like a closed chapter inside basketball circles was quietly becoming an open wound everywhere else. And while the league believed it had reinforced its authority, something else was happening in the background. Because the people who actually profit from attention weren't applauding the decision. They were taking notes. While the coaching staff stood by their decision and publicly framed the Olympic snub as a basketball necessity, a very different reaction was unfolding on the business side of the sport. Because for NBC, this wasn't about defensive versatility or lineup balance. It was about missed opportunity on a scale that doesn't come around often. NBC wasn't just another observer in this situation. They were the primary rights holder. The company responsible for turning the Olympic Games into a global television event. And in the months leading up to roster finalization, internal expectations were already set. Executives had been watching the same numbers everyone else had. They saw the surge in interest tied directly to Caitlin Clark. They understood how her presence transformed regular season games into must-watch events. From their perspective, she wasn't just a player, she was a ratings multiplier. So when the roster dropped and Clark's name wasn't there, the reaction wasn't confusion. It was disbelief. According to multiple industry insiders, NBC executives viewed the decision as a self-inflicted wound. Not because Team USA couldn't win without her, but because the network had been counting on her to convert casual viewers into committed ones. She was the bridge between hardcore basketball fans and the massive audience that only tunes in when something feels culturally important. Gold medals matter. But gold medals without buzz don't drive the same engagement. From a broadcast standpoint, the Olympics aren't just about competition. They're about moments. About faces. About stories casual viewers can latch onto instantly. And Clark had already become one of the few athletes in women's basketball with true crossover appeal. Leaving her off the roster didn't just limit NBC's marketing options. It erased one of their strongest narrative anchors. What frustrated executives even more was how preventable it felt. This wasn't an injury situation. It wasn't a last-minute withdrawal. It was a conscious choice made despite every data signal pointing in the opposite direction. And when internal conversations began comparing projected numbers with and without Clark, the gap was impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, the coaching staff believed the outcome would justify the decision. Win gold, silence the noise, prove the system works. From a basketball lens, that logic made sense. But from a television lens, it missed the point entirely. Winning doesn't automatically equal attention. By the time the games wrapped up, NBC had what it needed to confirm its fears. Viewership was solid, but it never reached the explosive levels that Clark-driven games had been generating back home. The audience tuned in for the event, but it didn't linger the way it had during fever broadcasts. The emotional investment wasn't the same. The buzz faded quickly. And that's when the internal recalculations began. Because from NBC's perspective, the message was clear. The league had prioritized control over growth, tradition over traction. And in doing so, it forced the network to rethink how much influence coaches and selection committees should have over a product they were paying billions to distribute. This wasn't about punishing anyone. It was about course correction. And while the coaches may have believed the Olympic victory closed the book, NBC was already preparing the next chapter. One where decisions wouldn't be dictated solely by basketball philosophy, but by the realities of modern media economics. The tension didn't explode publicly at that moment. But the fuse was lit. Once the Olympic cycle ended, the debate shifted from emotion to evidence. And that's where things became impossible to ignore. Because while coaches were still defending philosophy and precedent, the people on the business side were staring at numbers that told a completely different story. The comparison wasn't flattering. Regular season games featuring Caitlin Clark were generating levels of engagement that traditionally only show up during championship runs or international finals. Ticket demand spiked. Secondary markets surged. Social clips exploded within minutes. And most importantly, viewers weren't just tuning in, they were staying. Average watch time climbed. Casual fans became repeat viewers. Entire broadcasts were being reshaped around her presence without anyone officially saying it out loud. Then those figures were stacked next to Olympic viewership data. Yes, the games performed well. They always do. But when analysts isolated moments of peak engagement, the truth became uncomfortable. The ceiling wasn't set by medals or legacy matchups. It was set by attention. And attention followed familiarity, narrative, and personality far more than systems or schemes. For networks like NBC, this wasn't surprising. It was confirmation. Broadcasters don't operate on sentiment. They operate on retention curves, demographic crossover, and repeat exposure. When those metrics were laid out, the conclusion was blunt. Clark wasn't just contributing to growth. She was driving it. That realization reframed everything. The new media rights era, valued in the billions, wasn't designed to reward parity or patience. It was designed to reward momentum. And momentum doesn't wait for permission. It accelerates toward whatever keeps people watching, sharing, and talking. In that environment, the idea that the league could slow down its biggest draw without consequences was never realistic. What changed after the data review wasn't public messaging. It was strategy. Executives began asking different questions. Not, how do we protect balance? But, how do we maximize return? Not, who fits best? But, what keeps viewers engaged longest? And once those questions entered the room, the old arguments lost their power. Because spreadsheets don't care about hierarchy. They don't care about who paid their dues or how long someone's been in the system. They care about patterns. And every pattern pointed in the same direction. Games without Clark performed fine. Games with her performed differently. Louder. Longer. Wider. That gap is what forced the next move. Not because anyone wanted to challenge coaches directly, but because the cost of ignoring reality had become too high. In a landscape where every second of attention is monetized, turning away from your strongest asset isn't principled. It's inefficient. And once that truth settled in, the question was no longer whether the league could afford to center its future around one player. It was whether it could afford not to. The real breaking point came when NBC stopped thinking defensively and started acting decisively. Quietly at first. No grand announcement. No public confrontation with the league. Just a noticeable change in how coverage was being planned, scheduled, and framed behind the scenes. According to multiple reports circulating inside media circles, NBC began restructuring its future approach with one clear priority in mind. Follow the audience, not the hierarchy. That meant leaning into Caitlin Clark as the gravitational center of coverage, regardless of standings, seniority, or traditional power structures. Conversations shifted toward Clark-centric camera emphasis, narrative-driven storytelling, and prime-time scheduling that aligned specifically with her appearances. Not because she demanded it, not because she negotiated it, but because the numbers made the decision unavoidable. From the network's perspective, this wasn't favoritism. It was efficiency. But to coaches and long-standing decision-makers inside the league, it felt like an overreach. A bypass. A quiet declaration that their authority stopped at the sideline and didn't extend into the broadcast booth anymore. For decades, control flowed one way. Coaches dictated the product. Networks amplified it. Now that order was reversing. And that reversal is what reportedly caused the explosion. Because when a broadcaster starts shaping the narrative independently, it removes one of the last levers coaches believe they still hold. You can bench a player. You can limit touches. You can freeze someone out of certain opportunities. But you can't stop cameras from turning toward the person viewers came to see. That loss of control cuts deep. For figures who built their careers on the idea that no individual should eclipse the team, NBC's shift felt like a philosophical betrayal. It signaled that collective identity was no longer the centerpiece of the product. Attention was. And attention doesn't obey playbooks. What made this moment even more volatile was how subtle it was. There was no public fight to rally against. No quote to dismiss. No policy to debate. Just the slow realization that media partners were preparing to tell a story the league couldn't fully manage anymore. And once that realization set in, frustration turned into resentment. Because this wasn't just about exposure. It was about relevance. About who gets to define success in a league that's entering its most financially significant era ever. The coaches had spent years preaching that winning solves everything. That gold medals and banners would protect the system. But NBC's move suggested something far more unsettling. Winning matters. But visibility matters more. That's why this shift landed like a threat. Not to basketball integrity, but to authority. And for those who believed they could enforce tradition indefinitely, it was the moment they realized the center of gravity had moved, and taken their influence with it. And beneath all that anger and disbelief was an even more uncomfortable emotion beginning to surface. One no one wanted to say out loud yet. Because control wasn't the only thing slipping away. Once the control narrative cracked, something far more personal began to surface inside the league. Not publicly. Not in press conferences. But in tone, body language, and the way conversations shifted behind closed doors. Because beneath all the talk about philosophy and structure, there was another emotion driving the backlash. One that makes people uncomfortable precisely because it feels taboo. Jealousy. Not the petty kind. The deep, unresolved kind that builds over years. For veterans who spent a decade or more grinding through low salaries, overseas seasons, brutal travel, and minimal media attention, the sudden rise of Caitlin Clark felt like history skipping a chapter. Many of these players helped keep the league alive when nobody cared. They played through obscurity, carried the league's values, and waited patiently for recognition that often never came. Then a rookie arrived. And within months, the entire media ecosystem began orbiting her. From the outside, it looks like overnight success. But inside locker rooms, it feels like erasure. Like all that sacrifice was necessary, but not rewarded. NBC's pivot didn't create that feeling, but it validated it. It confirmed the fear that no matter how much you win or how long you stay loyal, attention will always flow toward whoever moves the needle most. That's a hard truth to swallow. For coaches and veterans who built their identity around the collective, Clark's visibility becomes symbolic. She isn't just a player anymore. She's a mirror reflecting what the league values now versus what it used to value. And when the reflection doesn't align with your sacrifices, resentment grows. This is why the backlash feels so emotionally charged. It's not really about her shot selection or defensive effort. It's about watching the spotlight lock onto someone else and realizing it may never swing back. NBC's endorsement made that fear real. It turned a hypothetical future into a present reality. And for players who believed success would eventually even things out, that realization hits like a betrayal. The danger is what this does to team environments. When some players feel validated by the attention and others feel diminished by it, unity becomes fragile. Coaches can preach selflessness all they want, but it's difficult to sell sacrifice when the market rewards individuality so aggressively. Especially when that reward comes from outside the league's control. What makes this even more volatile is that no one wants to admit what they're feeling. Jealousy sounds ugly. It undermines credibility. So instead, it gets dressed up as concern. About fairness. About balance. About culture. But underneath those words is the same fear repeating itself. If this is the future, where do the rest of us fit? And once that question takes hold, it doesn't stay confined to meetings or interviews. It bleeds onto the court, into how players compete, into how they react to whistles, into how much physicality is suddenly considered acceptable. Because when respect feels threatened, competition stops being clean. And that's when the situation starts to move from uncomfortable to dangerous. Once jealousy enters the conversation, money is never far behind. And in this situation, money isn't a side effect. It's the engine driving everything. Because while coaches talk about legacy and banners, the modern sports ecosystem runs on exposure, conversion, and brand velocity. And that reality has never been clearer than it is right now. Here's the uncomfortable truth many insiders are grappling with. Gold medals don't monetize the way attention does. Winning matters. It always will. But in today's media landscape, winning without visibility is a diminishing asset. Endorsements don't follow box scores. They follow eyeballs. Side projects don't materialize because of defensive schemes. They materialize because millions of people recognize a face, a name, a narrative. And that's where the imbalance becomes impossible to ignore. Caitlin Clark's rise accelerated revenue conversations the league had been avoiding for years. Charter flights, sponsorship interest, network leverage. All of it sped up once the audience arrived in force. But that acceleration came with a catch. The attention wasn't evenly distributed. It pooled. And wherever it pooled, money followed. That's what makes this moment so volatile for the old guard. Because from their perspective, the reward structure feels broken. Players who spent years building resumes are watching a newcomer unlock opportunities they were told would only come with time. And NBC's strategy doesn't just acknowledge that imbalance, it leans into it. Prime time slots, extended coverage, narrative focus. All of it signals that marketability now outweighs merit in determining who gets the biggest stage. But from a business standpoint, this isn't corruption. It's alignment. Television has never been a meritocracy. It's a popularity contest with consequences. And once billions of dollars are committed, networks don't gamble on ideals. They invest in what converts. That's why this clash feels so existential to coaches who believed winning would always protect their authority. Because the numbers say otherwise. Every additional camera angle, every featured segment, every promotional push increases leverage. Not just for the player, but for anyone connected to that spotlight. Endorsement deals become easier to negotiate. Media appearances multiply. Equity opportunities open up. Meanwhile, those outside the focus circle feel the gap widening, financially and culturally. This is why the reaction inside certain camps has reportedly been so intense. It's not about pride alone. It's about realizing that the economic future of the sport may no longer reward longevity or loyalty the way it once did. And that realization threatens the entire value system the league was built on. The irony is that this influx of money benefits everyone, at least in theory. Higher visibility lifts the league. Better deals raise the floor. But emotionally, that's hard to accept when the distribution feels uneven. Especially when the spotlight seems permanently fixed. And once you understand that this isn't about medals or minutes, but about who controls access to revenue, the anger starts to make sense. Because the fight isn't over recognition. It's over relevance in a league that's finally worth real money. If the present tension feels uncomfortable, the future is what's truly rattling people inside the system. Because everything happening now is being viewed through one looming lens. The 2028 Olympic Games in Los Angeles. For Team USA, the Olympics have always been the ultimate justification. Win gold, validate the process, silence the noise. That logic worked when broadcasters followed the federation's lead. But that balance changes dramatically when the broadcaster is NBC, and when the games are on home soil, in prime time, in the largest media market the sport has ever touched. This is where the current situation stops feeling like backlash and starts feeling like a warning. From a network perspective, Los Angeles 2028 isn't just another Olympic cycle. It's a showcase moment. A ratings opportunity that won't come around again for decades. And the idea that the most recognizable figure in women's basketball could be sidelined again? That's not just unlikely, it's commercially unthinkable. That's why many insiders believe this recent NBC shift wasn't accidental or reactive. It was declarative. A signal that the rules are changing. Because once a broadcaster commits billions and ties its long-term strategy to audience behavior, it doesn't quietly accept decisions that limit reach. It applies pressure. Not publicly, not aggressively, but structurally. Through coverage priorities. Through marketing emphasis. Through the subtle message that some players are no longer optional to the product. For the coaches who made the 2024 call, that realization hits hard. It suggests that their autonomy, once unquestioned, is shrinking. That future selections may not be dictated solely by fit or chemistry, but by broader considerations they don't fully control. And no coach wants to feel like a TV executive has a seat at the selection table. But money changes who gets invited into the room. The fear isn't that NBC will demand lineups. It's that their influence makes certain outcomes inevitable. That leaving a generational draw off the biggest stage again would create consequences far beyond criticism. Consequences tied to partnerships, exposure, and leverage the federation depends on. That's why this moment feels like a line in the sand. Not a public ultimatum, but a quiet recalibration of power. One that tells the old guard the next cycle won't be handled the same way as the last. That what happened in 2024 won't be repeated in 2028. And that resistance may come at a cost no one wants to pay. Because once the biggest stage, the biggest market, and the biggest audience converge, the system doesn't get to pretend stars are interchangeable anymore. And for those who built their authority in a different era, that's a deeply unsettling reality. When resentment has nowhere safe to go, it usually finds an outlet. And in a league as physical and competitive as the WNBA, that outlet is often the court itself. This is the part of the story that makes league insiders uneasy, because once frustration spills into gameplay, things can escalate fast. The increased physicality around Caitlin Clark didn't start with NBC. It started earlier, as attention around her grew and patience around her presence thinned. Hard fouls, extra contact, plays that lived in the gray area of basketball intensity. Nothing overt enough to trigger major discipline, but frequent enough to spark conversation. And conversations matter. Because when players begin to feel that the game is being tilted, not by referees, but by media narratives, it creates a dangerous feedback loop. One side feels protected by cameras. The other feels ignored. That imbalance doesn't stay theoretical for long. It shows up in how closely defenders play, in how much contact is considered acceptable, in how little benefit of the doubt is extended. The NBC shift threatens to amplify that tension. If opposing players believe that every Clark moment will be replayed, analyzed, and amplified, frustration builds. And frustration, when mixed with pride and long-standing resentment, can harden into aggression. Not because anyone wants to hurt her, but because proving a point becomes more important than protecting the product. That's the paradox the league now faces. The more the media centers one player, the more others feel compelled to push back physically. And the more physical the game becomes around her, the more coverage it generates. That cycle feeds itself. Physical play becomes a storyline. The storyline boosts ratings. Ratings justify the focus. And the focus fuels more resentment. It's television gold. But it's a governance nightmare. Coaches, especially those who see themselves as guardians of the sport, reportedly hate this direction. From their perspective, basketball is being reduced to spectacle. Drama over discipline. Reaction over structure. The league they fought to legitimize now risks becoming something closer to reality TV, with real bodies absorbing the consequences. And yet, stopping that transformation may no longer be possible. Because once fans are invested emotionally, they don't just watch games. They pick sides. They argue. They clip moments. They replay fouls. They build narratives that live far beyond the final score. And those narratives don't require league approval to spread. This is why the situation feels so volatile. It's no longer just about media coverage or roster politics. It's about how attention reshapes behavior, how resentment alters competition, and how a league that desperately wanted eyeballs now has to manage what those eyeballs encourage. At this point, the question isn't whether the spotlight is fair. It's whether the league is prepared for what happens when the spotlight refuses to move. This is the part that truly shifts the balance, and the reason anxiety inside the establishment keeps growing. Because for the first time, the league is facing a reality it never had to confront before. Caitlin Clark doesn't actually need the system the way the system needs her. In earlier eras, players had no leverage outside the league structure. You played where you were told, when you were told, and you waited for opportunity. Media exposure was centralized, gate-kept, controlled. If you weren't featured, you were invisible. That's no longer the case. Clark exists in a different ecosystem. Her value isn't confined to one jersey, one season, or one governing body. It's portable. Her audience follows her, not the other way around. And that gives her options. Options that quietly terrify institutions built on exclusivity and control. Off-season alternatives already exist. Media projects exist. Exhibition concepts exist. Ownership stakes exist. If the environment becomes hostile, dismissive, or restrictive, she doesn't have to fight the system head-on. She can simply step sideways and let attention follow. And wherever attention goes, money and relevance follow right behind it. That's the leverage the old guard didn't account for. The irony is that by trying to humble her, portions of the system may have accelerated this shift. By freezing her out of certain narratives, they pushed her closer to independence. And once a player realizes they can thrive without centralized approval, the power dynamic flips permanently. From the league's perspective, this is dangerous. Because systems rely on participation to legitimize themselves. Team USA needs stars to validate its authority. Leagues need their biggest draws to reinforce the importance of the platform. If the most influential player begins operating as an independent entity, choosing when and how to engage, the structure weakens. That's why the NBC alignment matters so much. It signals that major media partners aren't just invested in the WNBA. They're invested in Clark herself. In her presence. Her narrative. Her ability to hold an audience. And that distinction is subtle but massive. It means the league is no longer the sole gateway to exposure. For coaches who built careers on the idea that no one is bigger than the team, this is a philosophical collapse. Because the market is proving otherwise. Not because Clark demanded it, but because the audience decided it. And once that decision is made, systems don't get to negotiate from a position of strength anymore. They adapt. Or they watch relevance drift toward whoever understands the new rules faster. That's the quiet fear behind the frustration. Not that Caitlin Clark is difficult to manage, but that she's becoming impossible to contain. While coaches and executives debated philosophy behind closed doors, the fans had already reached their conclusion. And unlike internal meetings, public opinion doesn't wait for consensus. It moves fast, it spreads faster, and once it hardens, it's almost impossible to reverse. The reaction online wasn't subtle. Comment sections lit up. Clips were dissected. Old quotes were resurfaced and recontextualized. And the dominant sentiment wasn't confusion, it was vindication. A large portion of the audience believed the Olympic snub had never been purely basketball-related, and NBC's shift felt like confirmation that something had gone wrong at the decision-making level. To many fans, this wasn't about disrespecting veterans or undermining the team concept. It was about correcting what they saw as a misread of the moment. The league finally had momentum, finally had a figure pulling in new viewers, and instead of embracing it, the establishment appeared to resist it. That resistance stuck with people. Especially after dismissive comments from legends like Diana Taurasi, whose remarks about reality were interpreted by many as condescending rather than cautionary. Whether that was the intent or not, the damage was done. Fans didn't hear mentorship. They heard gatekeeping. And once that narrative took hold, it shaped how every subsequent move was judged. So when NBC began leaning into Clark anyway, the response felt almost celebratory. Not because fans wanted chaos, but because it felt like the market correcting a mistake. Like the audience saying, "You don't get to ignore what we're showing up for." In that framing, the network wasn't undermining basketball values. It was listening to demand. This is where the gap between purists and viewers became impossible to ignore. Basketball insiders spoke about spacing, defense, and balance. Fans spoke about excitement, visibility, and why they tuned in at all. And those two conversations stopped overlapping. One side was defending legacy. The other was defending relevance. That divide explains why the backlash inside Team USA circles feels so intense. It's one thing to be criticized by online trolls. It's another to be overruled by the very audience that funds the entire operation. Because when fans stop buying the explanation, authority weakens. And when networks align with that audience instead of the establishment, the power shift becomes undeniable. At that point, the debate isn't really about Caitlin Clark anymore. It's about who the sport is actually for. The people guarding tradition, or the people keeping the lights on by showing up, watching, and caring. As the frustration intensified, one figure kept surfacing at the center of the storm: Cheryl Reeve. Not because she was alone in making decisions, and not because she suddenly became a villain, but because she symbolized the old structure colliding head-on with a new reality. Reeve occupies a rare position in women's basketball. She isn't just a Team USA decision-maker. She's also a long-tenured architect of success at the professional level. That dual role has earned respect for years. But in moments of controversy, it also creates perception problems that are hard to escape. From the outside, many fans began to wonder whether the Olympic snub was truly neutral. Questions circulated about conflicts of interest, legacy protection, and whether certain philosophies were being preserved at the expense of growth. None of this was ever formally proven, but perception matters more than intent once a narrative takes hold. When Reeve publicly dismissed the idea that the decision was personal, the explanation didn't land the way it might have in the past. Trust had already eroded. Fans didn't hear reassurance, they heard deflection. And in an era where transparency is demanded instantly, careful, measured responses often get interpreted as avoidance. That's why NBC's shift felt so symbolic. It wasn't just a programming change. It was a rejection of the very philosophy Reeve represents: the belief that coaches, not stars, should define the league's identity. For decades, that approach was necessary. The WNBA survived because discipline, structure, and collectivity came first. But survival and growth are different battles. What Reeve and others are now facing is the realization that the coach-led era may be ending. Not because coaches failed, but because the environment changed faster than the principles that governed it. Media partners aren't interested in preserving balance. They're interested in sustaining attention. And attention doesn't organize itself around systems. It organizes itself around people. For someone who has spent her career reinforcing the idea that no individual is bigger than the team, watching a broadcaster effectively overrule that belief has to feel like a personal defeat. Not loud, not dramatic, but definitive. A signal that authority no longer flows from the bench outward. And that's what makes this moment so uncomfortable. Because this isn't about one roster decision or one Olympic cycle. It's about an entire generation of leadership realizing that the rules they mastered no longer guarantee control. The game they helped build is evolving into something they don't fully recognize. And worse, something they can't steer. That realization hurts more than criticism ever could. It means the conversation is no longer about whether the decision was right or wrong. It's about whether the system itself is still equipped to lead in an era where power is decided by audiences, not committees. And for the first time, that answer doesn't feel obvious anymore. When you strip away the personalities, the press statements, and the online arguments, what's left is something much bigger than a roster decision or a broadcast strategy. What's happening right now is a shift in who actually holds power in women's basketball. and it's happening whether the establishment likes it or not. For decades, the league operated on a simple belief system. Respect was earned through time. Attention followed winning. And control flowed downward from institutions to players. That model made sense when the sport was fighting for survival and relevance. But survival mode and growth mode don't follow the same rules. Caitlin Clark didn't break the system by demanding special treatment. She didn't lobby networks or undermine coaches. She simply arrived at the exact moment the audience was ready, and the audience responded louder than anyone expected. The cameras followed. The money followed. And once that happened, the old rules stopped working. The anger, the rumors of closed-door blow-ups, the frustration leaking into public view, none of that is really about Clark. It's about what she represents. A future where attention can't be rationed. Where hierarchy doesn't guarantee relevance. Where winning alone isn't enough to control the narrative. The NBC move didn't create this reality. It just confirmed it. This is what a paradigm shift sounds like. Not a dramatic collapse, but a quiet acknowledgement that the game has changed. The old guard can push back, criticize the coverage, and defend tradition, but tradition doesn't pay media rights fees. Audiences do. And audiences have already made their choice. The uncomfortable truth is this: women's basketball didn't lose its soul. It outgrew its old boundaries. And as long as the people holding the cameras are chasing engagement, not approval, the future will belong to whoever can command attention, whether the system is ready or not. That's not a hot take. That's the scoreboard. If you're following these shifts in women's basketball and want deep, no-fluff breakdowns like this going forward, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Liking the video helps push this conversation to more fans who actually care about the sport's future, and your comments matter more than you think. They shape what gets covered next and what doesn't. This channel is still growing, and every single subscriber helps us keep breaking down the stories the headlines don't explain. If you've got a take, a theory, or a disagreement, drop it in the comments. That's where the real discussion happens.